Hello friend, I am Rahat Hassan, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. Before going to start this particular lecture, I would like to welcome all of you in this particular online course on international relation in a changing world. Dear friends, today I will speak on world politics and foreign policy. So, this topic foreign policy again a very important topic in the discipline of international relation or world politics. So, foreign policy is a critical area of study in international relation or world politics that seeks to explore how a state interact with other state and non-state actors in the global arena. So, it involves the formulation, implementation and evaluation of a state's strategy towards achieving its national interest and objective. Therefore, every nation has to formulate and adopt a foreign policy to secure and serve the interest of its people and also to achieve the goal of our national interest in international relations or world politics or international politics. So, friends, we see that how the important is this topic, that is the topic of foreign policy in the discipline of international relations or world politics. So, in that regard we can refer the basic conception of international relations. International relations, we study the relations among the state in the nation state system and also the state's behavior in the international system. In that case, the state to state relations that we study, and in addition to that the state's relations with the non-state actors as well or any international actors as well, we study in the domain of international relations. So, in that sense friends, we can say that the state has to formulate a set of rules, set of principles and also a set of strategy, and that set of rules and strategy to achieve the basic objective of the state that defined in terms of national interest. So, that issue, the issue of principles, the guidelines and also the structure and the basic the national interest of the states, that are very important, and that we call as the formulation of foreign policy and the implementation of foreign policy in the domain of international relations. So, friend, in this class we will discuss the basic conception regarding foreign policy, what foreign policy is, and also we see or we will discuss the various factors affecting the formulation of foreign policy and certain key issues related to foreign policy, that is that for example national interest, national power, and also we will try to explain these conception of foreign policy or dynamics of foreign policy making and implementations, what are the actors involved in that, what are the various issues in the discussion of foreign policy. So, in order to explain that or in order to conceptualize that sort of things in the domain of foreign policy, that we will do that with the help of certain approaches in international relations. So, those approaches that are helpful to understand or to explain the conception of foreign policy or understanding of foreign policy, we will discuss that issues also in this particular lecture. So, this is the basic structure of this particular class. Now, friends, what are the relationship between the world politics and foreign policy? That is the basic issue of this particular lecture. Friends, as we say that we know about that the international relations is the state's behavior in the nation state system or state relations or the state strategy vis-a-vis other state in the nation state system and also the various international actors in the domain of international relations. So, these aspects of the relations among these actors, state to state and state to other international actors, that we study in the domain of international relations, or that is the basic essence of the study of international relations. Friends, in that sense we can say that the state to state relations or the state behavior in the international system may be cooperative in nature or may be conflicting in nature. That is the interpretation of the various school of thought in the domain of international relations, that like realistic school, liberal school and some other schools as well. So, friends, and in the globalized era and before that also the state, no state can behave or can live in isolation. State has to interact with the other actors in the international system, like it is like for example it is the other state or maybe some other international organization. So in nutshell we can say the states has to interact with the others in the international system, but there must be certain principles of that interaction. That interaction of the state in the international system, it is based on certain principles, certain strategies, certain values and certain objective. That objective is the protection and enhancement of the national interest. So that basic principles to interact or the objective to achieve achieve that national interest, state is interacting with the other state, and that principle is actually signifying or referring the concept of foreign policy. So in the domain of international politics, the state's behavior, their principles and their strategies or their various means to achieve the national interest of that particular nation, these all are the basic domains of the foreign policy. So in that sense we can say, friends, there is a kind of distinction between international relations or world politics with foreign policy. So there is a distinction between the both terminology, that is world politics or international relations and foreign policy. So in the case of international relations, the international relations talks about, or international relations we refer it as a kind of independent academic discipline, where we not only limited with the interactions among the state or the state's interaction with the other international actors, there are various theoretical things or there are various issues as well, but the main or core things that we study in the discipline of international relations, that is the state behavior, the state interaction with the other actors in the international system. So that interaction, the basis of the interactions, the objective of the interaction, that actually defining the concept of foreign policy and the subject area or the subject discipline that we call as the subject of international relations or world politics. So this is the basic distinction that we need to know about the world politics and foreign policy. So in that sense, we can establish the kind of relationship between the topic of world politics or international relations and foreign policy. Now friends, we can go for the topic which is related to this particular, which is the important issue that we need to discuss here, is that the concept, what is the concept of foreign policy or what is foreign policy is all about. So as we know that to give a kind of directions and to behave, how to behave the state with the other states in the international system, or the state's behavior with the other actors in the international system, which is based on certain principles. So that foreign policy is basically giving directions and meaning to the state's behavior or state interaction in the international system. So this is the basic essence of the concept of foreign policy. So in that sense, we can define foreign policy that the foreign policy refers to the comprehensive strategies, principles and actions that the sovereign state or government employs to interact with other state, international organizations and non-state actors in the global arena. And it also encompasses a wide range of diplomatic, economic, military and cultural activities designed to safeguard national interest, promote security, advance economic prosperity and project influence on the world stage. So that foreign policy, in nutshell we can say that the foreign policy is about national interest plus the means to achieve that. So that national interest is paramount for any state. The state interact with the other state in the nation state system just to protect the national interest of that particular nation. In addition to that, we also can explain in the domain of foreign policy that the state wants to protect the national interest, at the same time how to protect that sort of national interest of a particular nation. So in that way we can say there are various mechanisms, there are various means to achieve the national interest. That national interest may be achieved through diplomacy, through negotiations, through discussions, through propaganda and also through war and also through peaceful and cooperative environment in the international system. So with these kinds of means a national interest can be achieved. So the combination of national interest, which is the objective of every nation to protect, and the various means, the strategy and the basic principles that we apply to achieve that. So that combination of both, that is the national interest and the way to achieve the basic principles of and the strategies to achieve this sort of national interest, we call as the concept of foreign policy. Now friends, we also can take the definitions of the various eminent scholars in the field of international relations who define foreign policy in the domain of world politics. So in that sense, the foreign policy consists, before defining that things, we can also point out or look at, when we look at the concept of foreign policy, so we can make out that there are two important things or the two important issues that makes the concept of foreign policy in international relations or world politics. One is foreign, another is policy. So the foreign policy consists of two words, foreign, which implies territorial sovereign units which exist beyond the legal boundary of a particular state, and policy means guide to an action or a set of actions intended for the realization the goals of an organization. Foreign policy involves the strategies and tactics and commitment to which are taken for the fulfillment of a state's goal and interest. So in that sense, friends, we can say that the foreign policy, the terminology foreign policy consists of two important or two key words. One is the foreign, another is the policy. Foreign, which means that it signifies the territorial area which is beyond the sovereign state territory. So that is what the other territory in the international system. So that is what the foreign is all about. And the policy is what? It is the kind of strategy, it is the kind of tactics, it is the kind of various means to achieve, to interact in the sovereign state, sovereign territorial area of any other state. So that is what the concept of national interest and the means to achieve, the basic principles, the basic guidelines, things, and the directions and the meaning that the state is actually pursuing in the name of policy or in the making of policy, that we call it the concept of foreign policy. So in order to define the meaning or the conception of foreign policy, there are many scholars who define the concept of foreign policy in the domain of world politics. So one of the C. Roddy, Anderson and Carstol, he defined for foreign policy that the foreign policy implies formulation and implementation of a set of principles which shape the behavior of a state while negotiating with other states to protect and further its own interests. So again, that we try to explain that the foreign policy is about a national interest. The nation is intended to achieve that, and it is the interaction of the state in the international arena. So that definition, that from these definitions we can make out that kind of explanation about the concept of foreign policy. Another important scholar, Padelford and Lincoln, defined foreign policy by pointed out that a foreign policy is the way through which a state decide what course of action it will generally pursue in world affairs within its limits of strength and reality of international environment. So here friends, we can find a new words or the new element in the domain of foreign policy, that in international system or international relation, state interact with the other international actors like a state or any other international organization. For that matter, the state having certain principles, and in addition to that, the basic objective is to achieve the national interest of that particular nation. But here in that definition, in this particular definitions, we also see a kind of the word international environment, which means that state, while interacting with the other state with certain principles that we call as the foreign policy, in making of the foreign policy or in the implementation process of the foreign policy, the state is also taking into consideration the external environment, the external factors that is happening in the world stage or in the world politics. So that the foreign policy is making in the context of the things which is happening in the international systems as well. So the another things that this particular definition is adding in the discussion or in the understanding of foreign policy. Now friends, another important scholar who defined the concept of foreign policy, that the George Modelsky, he defined foreign policy is a kind of system of activities evolved by communities for changing the behavior of other states and for adjusting their own activities to the international environment. So, in that sense, the another thing elements or the components we can make out of this particular definition, that in the foreign policy, the basic objective is to achieve national interest, but at the same time the state is the objective to achieve, or the way to achieve the national interest. The state is doing what? The state is actually trying to regulate or control the behavior of the other state in a desired way. The desire that state A is actually want to from the state B in the international system. So, the state A is trying to, through that foreign policy, trying to control or trying to influence the behavior of the other state in the nation state system or any other actors in the international system. If it is possible, then fine. If it is not, then the state in sometimes as well has to adjust in according to the situation that prevail in the international system. So, that foreign policy is not only about to influence the others in the international system, the other state has also to adjust itself in according to the things which is prevail in the international system. So, friends, in summary we can say the foreign policy, out of that discussion or out of that definitions given by the many scholars or the eminent scholars in international relations, that the foreign policy is a set of principles and means adopted by a nation for defining, justifying and securing the objective of national interest. And foreign policy is deeply rooted in a nation's objective, that is the national interest, values and priorities, reflecting its aspirations, historical experiences and geographical circumstances. It also involves the formulations and implementation of policies aimed at managing relationship with other countries, addressing regional and global challenges and pursuing both short term and long term goals. So, these are the basic outcome, these are the basic things that define the concept of foreign policy or the issue of foreign policy in the domain of world politics, and also it establishes the relationship between the two terminology, that is the terminology of foreign policy or the role of foreign policy rather in the domain of world politics or international politics or international relations. Now, friends, we can discuss or we will discuss the another important components of this particular lecture, that the subject content of the foreign policy involves, which means that what we study in the domain of foreign policy, what is the subject content, what is the subject matter that we study in the domain of foreign policy or in the issue within the issue of foreign policy. So, the number one subject content is the foreign policy is reflecting or referring or the foreign policy involves a set of principles adopted and followed by a nation or policy makers. Nation say mean the referring the state, or that the policy makers taking decision or making foreign policy on behalf of the state. So, the foreign policy is actually involving or referring the set of principles adopted or followed by the nations or the policy makers, while the policy makers making any sort of foreign policy to interact with the other actors in the international system. So, another components or the another contents or the subject matter that involved in the discussion of foreign policy or in the process of making foreign policy is the objective, goals or aim of national interest which are to be attained or which are to be achieved. So, which means that the state, this is the basic objective of the state. When the state interact in the international system, the basic objective, the core objective or the paramount objective is to protect the national interest. So, that national interest, what is the objective of the national interest, what are the basic aims and goals of the national interest, that is also part and parcel of the foreign policy making process of a particular state or a nation. Another components or the subject content or the subject matter that the issue of foreign policy deals with, that it referring or it involving the means used for achieving these sort of objective, which means that the first category is what? The first is the set of principles, the set of broader principles and the basic values or the basic way of interacting the state in the international system, then setting the goals of national interest and national interest of that particular state, and the third component that we study in the domain of international relations or the foreign policy involved is the means to achieve that sort of things. So, as far as friends the means is concerned, it may be a kind of diplomatic in nature, that is the negotiation discussions, through that the state try to achieve the national interest. If it is not possible, then the coercive means also adopted or the power orientations also involved so far as the as a means of the foreign policy is concerned, so far to achieve the objective of the state or the objective of the national interest is concerned. Another important components or the things that we study or the foreign policy involved is the assessment of the gain and failure of the nation in respect to its goal of national interest, that we call as the relative gain, which means that when the state, that is what the assessment kind of foreign policy, when the foreign policy is implemented in the international system by a particular state or the policy makers. So, after implementing that, that is the outcome, the assessment of the outcome is the another important thing that we need to study or that policy maker needs to take into account as a kind of assessment, that in adopting a particular set of principles or the strategy by a particular state, whether that principle, set of principles or the strategy that we call as the essence of the foreign policy is giving any sort of positive gain or not, and in that sort of interaction with a particular set of foreign policy, whether other state is gaining more or less. So, that sort of analysis in terms of gain, in terms of failure and the success of the foreign policy, that is also one of the basic elements or the components of the issue of foreign policy in the domain of world politics or international relations. Now, friends, the another important things that foreign policy involved is the external environment and the domestic environment as well. So, whatever happening in the international system, so, and also the inputs which is coming from the domestic that is within the particular territorial boundary of the state. So, the things, the structure, the actors, the basic issues, the basic forces and the factors at the international level, and also within the domestic boundary of a particular state, that also need to be included in when a foreign policy analysis is done by the policy makers or any experts of the international relations. So, these are the basic issues, these are the basic things or the subject content the foreign policy in the process of making and implementation of the foreign policy involves. Now, friends, Mahendra Kumar or many other writers, for example, Goldstein, Mahendra Kumar, some other scholars as well, who that talks about that explain the conception of foreign policy in the domain of the world politics. They are referring that there are certain components of the foreign policy, some components that we already discussed. In addition to that, few things also discussed by these important scholars or the writers on international relations. That the components of the foreign policy, one of the components of the foreign policy is the policy makers. Another policy makers, which means that it is the policy maker or the statecraft or the state peoples, they actually taking decision, they actually formulating a kind of foreign policy when the state interacting in the international system. So, the policy makers is one of the important actors. In addition to that, the interest and objective, that is the national interest and other components of foreign policy. The principles of foreign policy, which means the set of principles. What are the set of principles? What are the strategies of that to achieve that particular interest, that is the national interest or the national objective of the state. And finally, friends, that is the means of foreign policy, which means that certain principles, certain strategies are undertaken by the state, and in that process certain means are also employed by the state so far as foreign policy implementation is concerned. So, it may be a cooperative, diplomatic in nature or maybe coercive in nature, that is use of force, like that kind of thing. So, this is all about that the subject content, what we study or what things that we need to study or we need to take into account while we discussing the issue of foreign policy in the domain of world politics. Now, friends, another important things we can discuss here is that which is related to the issue of foreign policy in the domain of world politics, that is the objective or common objective of the foreign policy of all nations, which means that certain objective are very common to every nation so far as the foreign policy is concerned, and certain objective is vary from one state to other state, one nation to other nations, but we can discuss here the common objective which are the common issues before the every state in the nation state system. So, the first objective of any nations or any foreign policy formulation is that maintaining the integrity of the state, which means that the national sovereignty and national integrity, that is the physical boundary, protection of the physical boundary or the security of the state, is one of the important objective of making foreign policy. And another important common objective is that providing for national security, which means that the physical territorial boundary and also the national security, that is the security of the nation, is another important components or the objective of the foreign policy. Third is the promoting economic interest, which means that the state, as we know that the state nature or the state activities transform from police state to the welfare state. So, now state engage in multiple way so far as the day-to-day life of the individual is concerned or their citizen is concerned. So, we find the activities of the state not in the political aspect or the political engagement, providing security to the citizens, providing security to the nations, protecting the national sovereignty of the state or the national security of a particular state. In addition to that, state also engage itself in the developmental activities or economic activities as well. So, in order to provide or in order to achieve that sort of economic interest, for example, in the international commerce, trade, free business, free commerce. So, that sort of economic engagement of the state is also or enhancing the economic interest of that particular state is also one of the objective of the state or making of the foreign policy when the state is trying to engage itself in the international system. Another important objective of foreign policy making is the protecting national prestige and developing national power. National power is another important things or another important objective while the state is making or pursuing any sort of foreign policy. So, the national power, for example, military power, national prestige, national kind of domination, state domination in the international system or accepted by the other nations in the international system. So, that sort of enhancement of the national power and the prestige is another important issue or another important common objective of every state while the state engage or while the state formulating any sort of foreign policy. And finally, friends, the another objective of foreign policy making is the maintaining world order. So, friends, as we know that the concept of balance of power, the concept of collective security as well, maintenance of international peace and security. So, in the world order, there is a distribution of power and the state trying to maintain that sort of power, and we also call the world order. In that world order, the state trying to adjust itself or state trying to make a kind of order in the world system where that particular state can have or can and would be in a position to protect their own national interest, and that national interest, that is the national security and also the national prosperity. So, these are the common objective, friends, that is common to every nation when the state is making any sort of policy that we call as the foreign policy to interact state in the international system. Now, friends, we can discuss another important things that is related to the concept of or the issue of foreign policy in world politics. It is the foreign policy instrument or the foreign policy strategy of the state or the nation. So, in that, friends, that already we know that the foreign policy is about protecting the national interest, and the foreign policy is referring actually the strategy, the values and also the basic principles, and out of that principles it gives a kind of directions and the meaning to the state actions in the international system. So, in that regard, a kinds of the objective is to protect the national interest, and to protect that national interest, state is actually applying various means to achieve that. So, that means may be cooperative in nature, diplomatic in nature, peaceful in nature, and certain objective may be or certain strategy or means may be coercive in nature, forceful in nature, violent in nature, or the war in nature, or conflicting in nature. So, one of the way or one of the instrument or the style or means of achieving that sort of national interest within the domain of foreign policy or with the help of foreign policy is the process of diplomacy. So, in that negotiation, discussions and diplomatic interactions, diplomats as a representative of their state. So, these are the basic means that diplomacy is the means through talk, discussions, negotiations, dialogues, or communications among the state through their diplomats. So, diplomacy is one of the instrument or one of the way of interacting or implementing the foreign policy of a particular state. Another way of implementing the foreign policy of a particular state in the international system is the publicity and propaganda. So, states are also engaged in a kind of propaganda and publicity just to implement or influencing the other actors in the international system so far as to implement their foreign policy to achieve their national interest or national objective. In addition to that, and that you find more in the case of Cold War period that where we see a kind of publicity and propaganda, how publicity and propaganda become a strategy of these two superpower during the Cold War period, USA and USSR, and through that they are trying to inject their policies in the world system. Another way to implement foreign policy is the power management, that is the issue of balance of power and collective security. Through that mechanism also, that is the balance of creating balance of power in the international system, and also the another mechanism of power management is the concept of collective security. For example, in the case of League of Nations and also in the case of United Nations, how that the nation state or all the in the nation state system, how the state collectively pursuing collective security, pursuing the principles of collective security to establish or to maintain international peace and security, and also to punish the aggressor state collectively by the nations in the international system. So, that is another important strategy, another important way to implement the foreign policy of a particular nation. Friends, another strategy is the international law and organizations, which means that the foreign policy has to adjust and the state is abiding the basic principles or the basic provisions or the ethics of the international law, and they are also obligatory to pursue the basic mandate of the international organization. So, we can take the example of United Nations as a matter of understanding about the international organization, how the member of the international organizations, how the state is actually adopting the basic values of the basic principles and the objective of the international organization. So, through that the mandate of the international organization to maintain international peace and security, economic prosperity, economic engagement as well. So, the member state of the United Nations, they adjust or they make their foreign policy in a way that through this international law and organization they try to maximize or they try to adjust their national objective or national interest in according to the basic provisions of the international law, as well as the basic philosophy or the objective of the international organization. Another methods or the another way of implementing the foreign policy by the particular nation is the economic methods as well. For example, friends, we can take the example of Cold War period. We know that how the United States of America and also the USSR, former USSR as well, they using that economic methods to implement their foreign policy in the Western countries. For example, the Marshall Plan and also that Communicons from the USSR. So, these are the examples how that economic package was given by the two former superpower during the Cold War period. So, that economic engagement, economic methods in the contemporary time, for example, free trade, free commerce, and also the various economic institutions. So, through that mechanism also the foreign policy of that particular nation is also implemented. Another important way to implement foreign policy is the war and peace. If these issues, that is the peaceful negotiation, discussions, economic engagement, power management, if these are not giving any sort of fruitful result to implement their foreign policy to achieve their national power or national interest, then state also using that sort of war and peace as a kind of foreign policy mechanism or the foreign policy instrument to achieve the national objective or the national interest of that particular nation. Friends, in that case also the new thing that emerged in the discourse of foreign policy is that the issue of cultural and civilizational connect. So that issue or that way of connecting or interacting the state in the international system, that out of that cultural connect or civilizational connect is one of the another important issue or another important way that emerged in the discourse of world politics. Through that mechanism, state is also trying to adjust their foreign policy, and also they are trying to implement their foreign policy, or they are trying to interact with the other state or other actors in the international system through the methods of culture and through the methods of cultural civilizational connect. So these are the friends, these are the basic instrument or the basic ways or the method of applying the foreign policy of a particular state by the policy makers of that particular state. Now friends, we will discuss now the various stages of foreign policy decision making. Now friends, in that case the foreign policy is a kind of cyclic process as well. In the first stage of foreign policy making, the policy makers take into account the various factors that is happening in the international environment and as well as in the domestic environment. So with that kind of factors which is there in the international environment or the domestic environment, that factors take into account while the policy makers are trying to make foreign policy or formulate foreign policy of that particular state. After identifying these factors, international factors or the domestic factors, for policy makers making or forensic making zero daning the goal of that particular nation, means the goal of the national interest, objective of the national interest and basic values of the national interest. So identification of the national interest or setting the national goal is another kind of components or another kind of phase that we can make out in the process of policy making. Once the national agenda is set, then the decision is taken by the policy makers. So here the policy makers are the statecraft. For example, maybe the executive branch of the government and also the legislative branch of the government, and within the executive and the executive branch of the government, we see the various kind of ministries, various kind of departments involved in the process of making the decision or making the foreign policy of that particular nation is concerned. Once the decision is taken or the things that is the foreign policy are formulated, then the executive branch of the government, that is the head of the state, foreign ministers, foreign secretary, they actually do what they actually do, they actually implementing the policies which are formulated by the policy makers and the various agencies involved in that. The last phases or the last stages of the policy implementation and policy formulation is the assessment of that policies as well. So once the policy is implemented in the international system, once the foreign policy is implemented by the policy makers or the executive branch of the government, then the executive, legislature branch and also the public of that particular nations and the various other civil society organization in that particular nations as well, they actually assess or they are doing the assessment of the implementation and the validity of that or the utility of that particular policies that formulated by the policy makers when the state is interacting in the international system. So in that sense, that feedback kind of things, assessment kind of things is actually influencing the policy making and policy implementation as well. So if the result is good, if the policy is giving a kind of success, then the policy would be continue. If it is not, then there will be a kind of revision, modification in the policy making and policy implementations as well. So that assessment as the foreign policy stage is equally important so far as in the policy making and policy implementation is concerned. Now friends, the various determinants of foreign policy decision making. So in this class friends, we discuss about the meaning of foreign policy and also the various objective, the concept of national interest, the relationship between international relations and foreign policy, and the various key concept, that is the national power, national interest, national objective, and how the foreign policy is formulated, how the foreign policy is implemented, and also the assessment of the foreign policy that we discuss in detail, which are related to the issue of foreign policy in the domain of world politics. So friends, thank you very much for your participation in this particular lecture about the meaning of foreign policy. Friends, in the coming lecture, in the second lecture, which is related to foreign policy in world politics, we will discuss about the another issues or the another dimension which is related to the concept of foreign policy in world politics. It is the determinants of foreign policy, external determinants and domestic determinants, and at the same time we also try to discuss, or we also try to explain the various theoretical approaches or the theoretical explanation just to explain the concept of foreign policy, how it is made, what are the actors, how we study foreign policy, that we call as the foreign policy analysis. So friends, in this second lecture over the foreign policy making, foreign policy making or the foreign policy in world politics, we will discuss over two important aspects of foreign policy in the domain of world politics. One is the determinants of foreign policy, another is the theoretical explanation or the theories of foreign policy or theories to explain foreign policy in world politics.